Hello and welcome. If you haven't already, I invite you to please click subscribe. There's no obligation, and it allows you to be notified of all new chapters. Additional information about the story, including the author, chapter warnings, and rating, can be found in the description below. All credit goes to the original author. All That Remains by Orphan Account, Chapter 30, Merciless. Thranduil awoke with a pounding headache. His body ached, particularly his head and neck, though he could not recall a reason why he would hurt in such places. He was in an uncomfortable position, bent over something that made the world rock and bulk beneath him. He was moving? No, he was being carried. Lids too heavy for him to even attempt to open his eyes, the Elven King could only frown as he felt the arm across his back as someone carried him. Why was he being hauled about like a sack of potatoes? It was rather undignified, he supposed distantly, unless he had been injured and his warriors had to hurry him away with haste. Except he had not been with warriors. Memory returned in a rush, and Thranduil forced his eyes open. His head protested as light and color assaulted his vision, and pressing pain made itself known behind his eyes. He did not care, for he was being carried by the largest man in the hunting party that had taken him from his home. That kick to the head, courtesy of Jodok, must have been having lasting effects, for Thranduil found the situation to be distant and funny, as if he was not being kidnapped. He, the great Elven King, had been taken by surprise in his home and been captured. How had that happened? Thranduil's thoughts sobered and sorted themselves out, his mind clearing as his senses calmed. He was in a bad situation, with bad being a serious understatement. He did not know who the men worked for or why they had taken him, but he doubted it was to give the warriors of Mirkwood something to do in their spare time. The only good news was that the hunters were not planning on killing him. If their goal had been assassination, they could have succeeded without taking him out of the palace and into the forest. The task of getting the Elven King out of the palace would not have been easy, and the blue-eyed elf wondered how they had managed it with all the extra guards. He felt a chill as realization snuck up on him. Either these men were trained so well that they had managed to sneak past all of the warriors, and by well, he meant Esgal's level of skill, or they had killed any guards that they had come across on the way out. The Elven King closed his eyes, bitterness rising at the thought of the latter. He prayed he would not come home, only to be gravely told of their losses. But now was not the time to worry and feel guilt. He had to take stock of his situation, and see if there was a chance for escape. Thranduil noted that his hands and feet were bound, and any weapons he had on his person were all absent. From his sword to the dagger in his boot, all weapons had been taken from him. He still had hand-to-hand combat to resort to, but in order to use it, he would have to be free of the ropes and his carrier. His mind was mostly clear, but his body still felt sluggish. He could barely move his head or open his eyes. Had the men drugged him somehow? Thranduil kept his eyes closed and his features slack, surprised none of the men had noticed his slight movements. He noticed they were speaking in Westron, muttering softly to each other, and listened in on their conversation. "I don't like these trees, Jodok," one man, Cone, was whispering, voice taut with mix of nerves and suspicion. "They're like the ones that moved to let us in." "All of the trees in Mirkwood are like that," the leader of the men explained, voice angry, bitter, and lacking any warmth. "It's the elves' blasted magic. They make things unnatural and strange, meddling with powers that can make a man lose his mind. If the elf wakens, don't let him talk, or he'll set the trees on us." In his voice, the Elven King could hear the undercurrent of fear. It was a fear born of ignorance, a fear of the unknown. He had heard it many times before, when those that believed rumors spread about elves spoke in whispers about the dangers of the firstborn. How they stole children in the night and replaced them with malevolent or possessed spirits. How they could seduce men into abandoning their families and wives, making them stay in the forest forever. How they were great and terrible sorcerers and witches, using their spells to manipulate nature, twisting it and awakening it in ways that were just not natural. How they were somehow to blame for hardship, pestilence, famine, and plague, these woes caused by an elf witch with a grudge. It was now apparent that Jodek was as prejudiced and fearful of elf magic as many other ignorant mortals. How the man had managed to act kind and intrigued by the immortals was beyond the Elven King. "I cannot believe I ever fell for this man's friendly persona," Thranduil thought scornfully. "I was distracted by his mask and smile when I should have looked into his eyes. I am sure I would have been able to spot hatred there, for no man like him can hide their fear of the unknown. Still, his prejudiced thoughts and paranoia make him all the more dangerous." Still, the men did have a right to fear the trees around them. The Elven King could hear them now, their silent anger and wordless hissing replaced by curiosity and understanding. Through the trees, he could sense that he was south of Dol Guldur, almost to the edge of the woods. That had been the darkest part of Mirkwood for a long time. The difference in the shadowed trees was startling, and even though Thranduil was not a censor, he could feel the change within them. Even now, they began to whisper to him, confused and concerned. "Elven King," they murmured, "Chanter, Awakener, you helped set us free." "Yes," Thranduil told them mentally. It was a pity the men did not know that communication with the trees need not be verbal. "I am pleased to be able to speak with you at last. I am glad that you are now free." "Free," the shadowed trees murmured, rustling their leaves. There was a shift in their consciousness, reminding Thranduil of someone narrowing their eyes. "The men carry you strangely, Elven King. We did not know why they run beneath our bows, so we did not attack. Why do they hurry?" Thranduil hesitated, wishing he had talked to Esgal more about speaking with shadowed trees. He remembered the assassin mentioning that it was best not to show weakness around them, but that was before the chant. He could not move much on his own, so he would have to take a risk. "The men are not my allies. They are my enemies. They have captured me, and I am afraid that I cannot free myself." The forest shifted, a low, threatening sound sounding through the trees. It took Thranduil a moment to realize that the shadow trees were hissing, snarling and growling in anger. The hunters paused, looking around themselves nervously. The Elven King wondered if they too could hear the trees' anger, or if the sudden movements of the wooden limbs were what gave them pause. "Bad men," the shadowed trees snarled. "Bad men, like bad nasty orcs and spiders. Always taking, taking, taking. How dare they take Elven King's freedom? Nasty, evil, bad men. Pick them off, one by one." They chuckled cruel and cold, and it was then that Thranduil fully understood what Esgal meant when he said the trees were sadistic, and what Radagast meant when he claimed they were still dark. The shadowed trees moved, limbs whipping and bending loudly like creaking wood. The hunters gathered close together, weapons drawn, with the men carrying Thranduil in the middle. "What's going on?" one man shouted, the Sinda recognizing Cohn's voice. Thranduil cracked his eyes open, coldly amused by the fear in the men's faces. Did they honestly think they could just carry him past the trees, and the trees would not do anything? With a snap, One tree lashed out, its long, wiry limb as purposeful and sentient as a living creature's. Cone screamed in terror as a black limb wrapped around his waist, yanking him up into the treetops and out of sight. Leaves rustled and the trees snarled, a loud cracking sound making the men below jump. A moment later, Cone was thrown back in front of the men, eyes blank and neck brutally snapped. The hunters cried out in shock and fear, cringing away from the still hissing trees. With a quick whip, another tree grabbed a second hunter, yanking him, screaming, out of sight. The body was not returned this time. Before the trees could strike again, Jodek hauled Thranduil off of his carrier's back. The Elven King slumped, unable to hold his body upright, but the lead hunter kept a firm grip on him. The Sinda felt more than saw the man place a knife against the elf's neck. He also felt Jodek's hand trembling and heard his rapid breaths. "Leave us be, you Morgoth-spawned trees," the man snarled, voice shaking the slightest bit. "Attack us again, and I'll slit his throat." The trees did not move and were silent. Their rage built and built, but they did not attack. They knew how to spot a desperate man, and if not for him threatening their Elven King, they would have felt glee at his terror. How dare the mortal threaten their Elven King, one of the ones who freed them? The trees' opinion of men dropped drastically, their trust in the race depleting. The silver-gold Megalag prince had let the men in, and Daelas had led the men to the king, but the men were bad. Daelas had not known. Megalag prince had not known. Elven King had not known. But the men were still bad. The trees resolved not to let any men into their sanctuary unless many chanters said it was safe. But these men, these bad men, they would not be let out. No matter how much they threatened, no matter how much they shouted and screamed, the trees would not let the bad men out of their sanctuary. The trees would not let these men live. Suddenly, their anger vanished, replaced by a feeling that Thranduil could only describe as sadistically smug. "Daelas comes," they purred. "Daelas comes. Bad men will pay. They will pay dearly. We do not need to kill bad men. Daelas will kill them all." The trees became silent and unmoving, as still as mortals thought trees were meant to be. The hunters relaxed, thinking they were safe, but Thranduil's mind was reeling. Daelas. Shadowleaf. There was only one person that could be. He almost felt bad for the men. Actually, he did not feel pity for them at all. As he was picked up once more, the men not checking to see if he was conscious, Thranduil smirked internally, despite the lasting weakness in his limbs. Daelas was coming. All he had to do was wait. The assassin caught up to the men just south of Dol Guldur. The fools were lost, unable to use the sun to track their path or figure out where they were. A suggestion to the shadowed trees had been enough for them to purposefully change positions and stay in landmark poses, only helping to further confuse the hunters. There were no animal prints to track down here, and quick brushes with soft leaves could take away any trails the men laid down to slow their escape. The men had lost the moment the trees turned against them. As if the shadowed trees would have even let them out once they reached the edge of the woods anyway. But they would not make it close to their destination. Death was here. The men had split up, the fools, trying to find the path they had been following. Jodek was with the Elven King, the Sinda's breathing slow, but his aura suggesting he was conscious. The assassin did not wonder about what was wrong with the elf. He would deal with that later, after the 6 threats he faced were eliminated. The first hunter was directly beneath him. Legolas let his body drop, landing on the man with his knives plunging into his target's upper back. The man fell forward, the sound of his body's fall muffled by the soft dirt. A quick, silent death, which was a lot more than the hunters deserved. But vengeance and anger were not a part of the assassin right then. All that mattered was the kill. All threats needed and would be executed. For the sake of his objective, there was no room for dramatics. He would strike without mercy, before his enemies even knew he was there. The second man was in his sight, but the other could not see him. Even if the hunter was facing in his direction instead of away, he still would not stand a chance. Legolas was a ghost, a silent shadow hidden among darkness and leaves. He was the hunter, the men were the prey, and they would not even have time to scream before their lives were expunged. He ghosted over to the second target, covering the man's mouth and severing his spine in a single fluid motion. The second hunter jerked once before going limp. Swift, silent, effective, and without a fuss. That was the way. The assassin laid the body down and moved on. 20 yards away, a quick stab to the back killed the third man, silent and without a fuss. The assassin turned, throwing a small dagger as the next target entered his line of sight. The man slumped, revealing another, but Legolas was already up in the trees, landing behind the fifth mortal. He slipped a garrote over the hunter's head, pulling it tight. The man gasped silently once, air cut off, before the thin, sharp metal sliced into his neck, as effective as a knife. Legolas unwound the garrote, the fifth target eliminated. Now, only one target was left. The hunter's leader had realized that something was wrong. He had the mostly limp Elven King upright, a knife against Lucinda's throat as he looked around at the still and silent forest with nervous, fear-filled eyes. His comrades were not answering, and he was afraid. A fearful man was dangerous, but Legolas was unconcerned. He did notice that in his tension, the man was pressing the blade too hard, a small trickle of blood dripping down the Elven King's neck. The assassin's lip curled. That would not do at all. Silent, cold, and deadly, the assassin was behind Jodok, almost as if he had appeared out of thin air. Before the man could so much as flinch, the detached elf jabbed a pressure point on his hand, forcing him to release the knife. A kick sent it flying away, a following jab releasing the man's hold on the Elven King. The golden-haired elf fell to the ground, still weakened by whatever the men had done, but Legolas did not go to him. In front of him, back to the assassin, Jodok opened his mouth to speak. Cold and apathetic, the assassin took his head. Without dramatics or unnecessary action, the deed was done. The men probably did not even know who had killed them, but such things did not matter to Legolas. Was he supposed to let them see who it was that killed them? Was there supposed to be some type of poetic justice? No. He was an assassin. He followed his mission. The Elven King's captors were dead, the mission was done, and that was that. Lucinda was sitting up, leaning heavily on one arm with a small bead of blood drying on his throat. He looked at Legolas, relief in his features, only to freeze as their eyes met. Something there scared the Elven King, his blue eyes widening, but the assassin did not care. Then the golden-haired elf was wobbly moving towards him, placing a hand on his arm. Legolas tensed at the contact, but did not lash out. The Elven King was his objective. His safety was the assassin's mission. Esgal, Lucinda was saying in a shaky voice. Esgal, it's over. Come back. It's all right. Legolas stared at him neutrally, though he did feel a bit of confusion. Was the Elven King upset? His eyes said that he was. Wait, he was upset. That mattered. The assassin blinked rapidly. The mission was over. The threats were gone. Emotions were no longer a liability. The pale, blonde-haired elf breathed, gently lowering the door that sealed away his emotions. Emotions returned to Legolas's eyes, the cold, calculating dark purple becoming its normal, bright violet shade. Everything was fine now, and he was back. There was no need for his assassin mentality any longer. This day, at least. But along with the returning emotions came all of the baggage and stress that he had locked away with them. Legolas trembled, suddenly feeling weak, and collapsed to his knees, breathing harshly. He struggled to sort out his thoughts as a pale and tired Thranduil hovered about him, but everything was a turbulent mess. Anger, sadness, grief, joy, longing, and most of all, guilt, guilt, guilt overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry," was all he could say to the blue-eyed elf. "I'm sorry." Thranduil was confused, his expression clear on his face, but he put a reassuring hand on the young elf's shoulder. "Esgal, you did nothing wrong." He glanced at the dead man next to him, then back at the shaking assassin. "You did nothing wrong." Legolas shook his head, unable to speak. That was not what he was apologizing for, not really. Yes, he grieved for the lives he had taken so coldly, but he did not regret it. The men had tried to take someone he cared about to the enemy, and that was unforgivable. No, Legolas was apologizing for leading them to the Elven King, for letting them in, for failing to protect Thranduil in his own home. But he could not voice the reasons for his apologies, because he was just so tired and drained from all that had occurred. Warm arms wrapped around him, and he blinked in surprise as the Elven King, his robes covered in dirt and hair out of place, held him gently, murmuring soft comfort in his ears. Legolas closed his eyes, stunned by the safety and familiarity he felt. He calmed and quieted, merely staying in Thranduil's embrace, and trying to place where he had felt such safety before. The thought reminded him of his still-lost memories, and he almost became hysterical once more. Aye, Valor. He was such an emotional wreck right now. "Shh," Thranduil murmured, soft and gentle like a father must act. "It's all right. Just breathe, Esgal. Breathe." Legolas breathed and calmed, but he did not try to lock away his emotions again. He decided that doing so while he was in such turmoil had been a bad idea, and vowed not to have a repeat of this incident if he could help it. If only he had had a chance to face his problems and sort out his feelings. But things had happened too fast. Seeing the young elf was calmer, Thranduil smiled a little. "Now, how about we start heading back, yes? The advisors and my children must be worried. Although," he frowned down at himself, partly annoyed, partly amused, "our trip may take a while. I still can't seem to move very well." "I'll help you," Legolas said softly. He stood and offered his hand to Thranduil, who took it. The Elven King leaned heavily on the assassin. Legolas felt relieved that the Sinda was no longer afraid of him, his fear melting away to be replaced by trust and concern. He was not asking questions either, which was good, since the violet-eyed elf was not sure he could answer them. They slowly made their way north, Legolas wondering when they would run into a patrol of warriors. Surely Iãgaw must have sent a group out to follow the assassin. Their pace was agonizingly slow, Thranduil stumbling every few steps, but the assassin kept him secure and upright. Around them, the shadowed trees were shrieking and cackling in glee. "Nasty bad men are dead," they sneered. "Though bad men died too quickly. Legolas should have killed them slow." Legolas winced, not quite at their words, but at the reminder of how coldly he had killed the men. Thranduil glanced sidelong at him and spoke softly to the assassin. "I now see what you mean by the shadow trees having interesting things to say. They can be unnerving, the violet-eyed elf admitted, but they are good allies to have, especially now that they are on the light side fully and consciously. Indeed, Thranduil murmured. His eyes narrowed and his back straightened, a determined glint entering his blue eyes. Before we head back to the palace or meet a patrol, there is something I need to do. Will you take me to Dol Guldur? The Elven King was pale and shaky, barely able to stand on his own, but the grim determination and stubbornness in his expression was not something Legolas would argue with. The assassin smiled slightly, despite the chill and anger he felt at the sound of the name of that cursed place. All right, we're going to pass it anyway. A half-hour later, the Elven King stood in black rubble and destroyed stone, looking around at the demolished place that had been his son's prison so long ago. Nothing had been left standing, the chant destroying all except the single shadowed oak tree that stood in what may have once been a courtyard. Esgal stood beside him, tense and looking around with an unreadable expression. His eyes blazed with purple fire and dark thoughts, his teeth almost bared. The blue-eyed elf could tell the young assassin did not like it here, at all. Still, Esgal did not complain, and faithfully helped the determined Elven King over to the shadowed oak when he asked. In fact, the assassin looked quite happy to be beneath the particular tree's boughs. Thranduil sat down heavily at the oak's roots, leaning against the black bark. Perhaps the Nazgul had realized an elfling would not last long here without nature, so they had purposefully planted the oak here. The Elven King felt no gratefulness towards his enemies for the act, though it did give him hope that his son had at least been all right when he was here. With everything else destroyed, there was only one way to find out anything about Legolas now. Thranduil placed his hand on the tree, opening himself up to his new connection with the shadowed oak. It was startled by the contact for a moment, then relaxed as it recognized him. Elven King, Liberator, Chanter. Yes, Thranduil replied silently. I am glad to be able to speak with you at last, Shadowed One. There is information I seek that only you may be able to provide. I will help, Elven King, the tree said solemnly, limbs twitching. Elven King is Chanter, and Dela's friend. Thranduil glanced at Esgal, who could only hear the tree's part of the conversation. The assassin smiled in encouragement. The golden-haired elf's stomach was twisted with tension, and his heart pounded in his chest. This was it. Either the tree would know about Legolas, or it would not. Either he would gain some insight into what had happened to his son, or there would be nothing. Thranduil took a deep, calming breath before speaking to the tree once more. My son, Legolas, was taken here. He had pale blonde hair and silver blue eyes. Do you know him? There was a beat of terrible silence. Then the tree brightened, perking up with happiness. Dela's! It draped a limb over the pale blonde-haired elf's shoulder. The assassin looked confused by the action. Thranduil sighed. No, not Dela's. The shadowed tree drooped. Not Dela's? Not Dela's, the Elven King repeated gloomily. Wrong-colored eyes. He let his head hit the oak's trunk, staring blankly up at the sky. So even here he could find out nothing about his missing son. Thranduil dearly hoped that his 3 questing children would be able to gather information on Legolas's whereabouts if he was not in Minas Morgul. The Cinda sighed again, feeling useless and helpless. Ay, Valor, he just wanted his son to be home and safe. Daelas, the tree above them said sadly, continually poking and brushing its branches over the assassin. Legolas, not Legolas. An expression that was a mix of shock, hurt, and a grimace crossed Esgal's face so quickly that Thranduil almost did not catch it. He felt the tree wince. Sorry, Legolas. I did not mean to make you sad more. You sad, angry, hurt now. No memories, no family. Sad, sad, sad. Thranduil turned and looked at Esgal, really looked at him, and saw the grief in the young elf's eyes and the pain and tension in his posture. The Elven King placed a hand on the assassin's arm, pushing away his own problems in order to focus on the now obviously burdened elf in front of him. Here I am, lost in my own woes, when you are also greatly burdened, the golden-haired elf said softly. What is troubling you, Esgal? The assassin pressed his lips together, his expression a mix between a scowl and a sad frown. Many things are bothering me at the moment. Normally, Thranduil would have let it go, trusting the young elf to deal with things on his own, or talk to Glorfindel. But the Balrog Slayer was nowhere nearby this time, and he could tell by Esgal's emotional eyes that there was too much weighing down on his mind. He had said that he had not had time to process his emotions, and apparently he still had not. The image of the assassin in near hysterics planted itself into Thranduil's mind, and he knew he could not let Esgal deal with his thoughts and emotions alone this time. Please, Esgal, Lucinda insisted when the violet-eyed elf refused to say more. Tell me. You are overwhelmed, I can tell. Please, tell me what has made you so upset, angry, lost. The assassin brought his legs up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. He did not look at the king, instead gazing at nothing. Thranduil sat beside him patiently, and simply waited for the other to speak. I found my memories. I do not have them back, but I discovered that they are trapped within my mental shield, hidden even from me, the assassin admitted at last, miserable. It turns out that I am the cause of my own amnesia, and there is nothing I can do to reverse the process without great risk to myself. His eyes closed and he shivered, as if remembering something terrible. When I found my memories, I was almost dead. I was only able to retrieve one before Radagast pulled me back with a healing spell. When I did regain that memory, my mind blanked completely, and for a second, I lost everything. The terror in the assassin's voice made a chill go up Thranduil's spine. I couldn't remember who I was, Esgal continued shakily. I could not remember my past, any of it. I couldn't remember my friends or the people I have grown to love or anything. It was terrifying. Now frustration entered his voice, bitter and filled with loathing. I almost lost my life and the rest of my memories for a single new one. And it's not even a memory, it's a fact, a stupid little name that won't ever help me find out who I was before. I almost lost everything for a blasted memory that isn't useful at all. His voice cracked, brittle with disappointment. At least it is something you did not have before, Lucinda chided gently. The price may or may not prove to be worth it in the future. His curiosity was officially piqued. What name could the assassin have gained that he was so upset at its apparent uselessness? What name could he have gained that would not help him find out something at least? Would you share with me what you discovered? The Elven King asked against his better judgment. It was not his business, but it also was if he wanted to help the young elf. It is unlikely that I will be able to help, but who knows? Besides, it is always best to share with someone. Esgal looked down, anger vanishing as he turned a light shade of pink. It's such a silly, useless thing. It tells me nothing about where I come from or who I was. That seemed to be the only thought he could focus on, and instantly his misery was back. Thranduil hated seeing the young elf so depressed. Even the most useless memory can be more important than you know, Thranduil said wisely. Tell me, what did you recover? Is it embarrassing? He asked as a teasing afterthought, thinking about the assassin's earlier blush. Esgal scowled at him, not in the mood. No, it's just pointless. Tell me what it is, and I may or may not agree with you, the Elven King said softly. Please, Esgal, tell me. Thranduil waited patiently as the assassin struggled with himself once more. Hesitance and a need to tell someone warred for dominance in his expression, Lucinda spotting grief and bitter hopelessness of the young elf's face. Finally, the assassin's expression settled into a look of strained bemusement. He smiled at the golden-haired elf beside him, grim but slightly amused. All right, he said, giving in. It turns out that I had a pet rabbit named Floppy.